Emily sat across from Daniel in an upscale restaurant, the soft hum of ambient music filling the air. The dim lighting made the room feel intimate, almost conspiratorial, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Her mind, however, was far from the elegance surrounding her. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass, barely registering Daniel's laughter as he recounted a recent adventure. Daniel had swept her off her feet from the moment they met, charming, spontaneous, and everything her marriage to Ryan wasn't. For months, they'd met in secret, these stolen moments together a stark contrast to the monotony she felt at home. She had long stopped feeling that spark with Ryan, their conversations growing stale and predictable over the years. Daniel was the antidote to her dissatisfaction, offering the thrill she craved. Yet tonight, as she glanced at her phone for the 5th time, a gnawing anxiety gripped her. Her phone buzzed again. The messages had been coming in all night, each one pulling her further from the evening she had planned with Daniel. The notifications on the screen taunted her, and though she had silenced her phone, the weight of those unread messages was palpable. She hadn't dared to open them, not yet. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she pushed her phone deeper into her purse, hoping to ignore the uneasy feeling that had been growing since they sat down. Daniel remained blissfully unaware, his focus entirely on her. His easy charm was almost infectious, and for a moment, Emily tried to relax, sinking back into the fantasy of their affair. But the feeling of being watched crept over her. It wasn't just her phone. The restaurant seemed too full, the air too thick, and her heart raced faster with every glance around the room. Suddenly, her gaze caught on something, or rather, someone. At a table across the room sat her cousin, her expression as cold as stone. Seated beside her were her aunt and uncle, their faces unreadable but unmistakably disapproving. Panic surged through Emily's chest. What were they doing here? Had they seen her with Daniel before? She glanced back at Daniel, but he was still talking, unaware of the storm brewing just a few tables away. The knot in her stomach tightened. Her family had always been judgmental, but this was different. They weren't just visiting the same restaurant by chance. Emily felt the walls of her carefully constructed double life closing in. Her palms were sweaty now, and despite Daniel's light-hearted stories, she couldn't escape the sinking feeling that her entire world was about to collapse. The evening, which had begun with the promise of escape and excitement, now felt like the edge of a cliff. And Emily was teetering, waiting for the ground to give way beneath her feet. Emily's pulse quickened as she finally gave into her anxiety, reaching into her purse to check her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked it, expecting another meaningless notification. Instead, a message from Ryan stared back at her, stark and cold. "Enjoy tonight because it's coming to an end soon." Her heart stopped for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. Emily read the message again, hoping she had misunderstood, but the words remained the same, sending an icy chill down her spine. Panic set in. Ryan knew. He had found out about her affair, and he was no longer staying silent. She had thought herself careful, had believed she could manage both lives without them colliding, but now, the evidence of her secret was in his hands. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. What did he mean by coming to an end? The ambiguity of his message gnawed at her. Was it a threat? A warning? The suddenness of it left her disoriented. She looked up from her phone, her vision blurry as the elegant restaurant around her seemed to fade into a fog. Daniel, still unaware, continued talking, his voice a distant murmur in her ears. Emily's fingers hovered over the screen, contemplating a reply, but what could she say? Her thoughts were in disarray, her stomach churned, and she felt the weight of inevitability press down on her chest. Ryan wasn't the confrontational type, he was deliberate, calculated. The fact that he had chosen to send this message now, while she was with Daniel, suggested that he had already set his plan in motion. She was trapped, and there was no way to undo what had been done. For a moment, Emily considered leaving the restaurant immediately, rushing home to confront Ryan, to explain herself before things spiraled completely out of control. But then what? What could she possibly say to justify her betrayal? The truth was undeniable, and the consequences seemed unavoidable. Her mind flashed back to the nights she had spent with Daniel, the intoxicating thrill of their secrecy. The danger had once been part of the allure, a way to break free from the dullness of her marriage. But now, standing on the precipice of discovery, she realized how deeply entangled she had become in her own lies. The fantasy was crumbling, and reality, sharp and unforgiving, was rushing in. Emily's hand tightened around her phone, the screen still glowing with Ryan's words. She couldn't let Daniel see her panic, not yet. But the message had shattered any illusion of control she once had. Ryan knew, and it was only a matter of time before everything she had tried to keep hidden would be laid bare. She forced a smile at Daniel, but inside, she was already bracing for the inevitable fall. Ryan had known for weeks. The first clue came in the form of a faint, unfamiliar scent of cologne clinging to Emily's clothes one evening. It wasn't his, and it certainly wasn't something she would normally wear. His suspicions had been subtle at first, barely more than a fleeting thought, but once planted, the seed of doubt began to grow. He observed Emily more closely, watched as her habits shifted, her late nights out, the sudden need for privacy when checking her phone, and the lies that started small but became easier to detect as time passed. Instead of confronting her directly, Ryan chose a different path. He gathered evidence, quietly, methodically, watching as Emily continued to weave her tangled web of deceit. Every time she came home late or invented a flimsy excuse, Ryan stored away each moment, building his case in silence. The more he uncovered, the more careless she seemed to become, almost as if her excitement with Daniel made her blind to the trap being set for her. Now, as Emily sat at the restaurant with Daniel, her mind clouded by Ryan's cryptic message, Ryan's plan was already in motion. She was unaware of the depth of his knowledge, still believing she could balance both sides of her life without either tipping too far. But Ryan had been watching, waiting, ensuring that when the moment came, it would be on his terms. Emily's anxiety deepened when she noticed familiar faces across the restaurant. Her cousin sat just a few tables away, accompanied by her aunt and uncle. The weight of their stares bore down on her, silent accusations in their expressions. They had always been judgmental, quick to point out any perceived flaw or misstep, but now, there was a knowing look in their eyes. Emily's stomach twisted into knots. They knew. Ryan had told them. Her attempts to maintain composure were crumbling. The safe, secret world she had shared with Daniel was dissolving under the scrutiny of her family's presence. They had been informed, and now they were here, quietly watching her make a spectacle of herself. Emily tried to focus on Daniel's voice, but the words slipped past her like water through her fingers. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and every glance in her family's direction felt like another blow to her fragile control. If you find it interesting, please like it. If not, please comment number 1. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. Ryan's silence had been the most dangerous part of all. While Emily believed she was orchestrating the game, it was clear now that Ryan had been one step ahead of her, watching as she unknowingly played right into his hands. And now, she could feel the net tightening around her, the noose of her lies drawing ever closer. Emily arrived home after what felt like the longest night of her life. Every step through the front door felt heavy, as if she were walking deeper into a trap she couldn't escape. The house was eerily quiet, but there was a tension in the air that told her everything had changed. The first thing she noticed were the boxes. Neatly stacked by the door, her belongings, clothes, shoes, personal items, packed with a precision that chilled her. It wasn't chaotic or rushed, it was deliberate, calm, as if Ryan had been planning this moment for some time. Emily's heart sank as she stepped closer, her breath quickening. She reached out to touch the boxes, her fingers shaking. On the dining table, 2 piles of papers caught her eye. She moved toward them, dread building in her chest with each step. The first pile was divorce documents, her name glaring up at her from the crisp white pages. Her worst fear, the one she had been trying to ignore, was now a stark reality. She felt a wave of nausea as she skimmed the lines, the finality of it hitting her like a ton of bricks. Ryan had already signed them. Next to the divorce papers was something that made her heart stop completely, a torn lease agreement. Ryan had not only filed for divorce but had also severed her connection to the home they shared. She no longer had a place here, no claim to the life she thought she could juggle between her husband and her lover. Everything had been taken from her in one calculated move. Emily's mind raced. What had she expected? That Ryan would sit idly by while she carried on her affair? She had underestimated him, ignored the signs of his growing distance and his calm, collected demeanor. It had all been leading to this. Ryan had let her walk into her own downfall, and now she stood in the wreckage of her choices. Desperation clawed at her. She reached for her phone, the only lifeline she had left. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed Daniel's number, hoping he would answer, hoping that he could provide some kind of solace. But the call didn't connect. The ringing stopped abruptly, and Emily's stomach dropped when she realized what had happened. Daniel had blocked her. She was truly alone now. Her husband had stripped her of everything, her home, her dignity, her security, and the man she had risked it all for had vanished without a trace. The world Emily had known, the life she had built, was crumbling around her, and there was no escape from the ruin she had caused. Emily stood frozen in the middle of the room, her mind racing as the weight of everything began to crush her. She had no home, no partner, and now, no lover to turn to. The once confident, thrill-seeking woman who had thrown caution to the wind felt hollow, reduced to a shadow of herself in a matter of hours. Her hands trembled as she tried Daniel's number one more time, hoping against hope that it had been a mistake. But again, the call refused to connect. He had cut her off. Panic rose in her chest, and she felt the sting of tears threatening to fall. She had given up everything for a man who had vanished at the first sign of trouble. How could she have been so blind? With no other options, Emily hesitated for a moment before dialing another number, her uncle's. He was the only family member she felt she could turn to, despite the earlier shame of seeing her relatives at the restaurant. She pressed the phone to her ear, heart pounding, and waited for him to answer. When her uncle picked up, his voice was cold, distant. "Emily," he said, the single word heavy with disappointment. She opened her mouth to explain, to plead for help, but he cut her off. "I know everything. You've disgraced us all. Your parents, your cousins, we all saw what you've done." Emily's throat tightened. She had feared this moment, the judgment of her family, but hearing it spoken aloud made the shame all the more unbearable. She was silent, unsure of what to say, as her uncle continued. "We'll help you," he said, though there was no warmth in his voice. "But you need to understand, you've ruined any chance of us looking at you the same way. You'll have to make amends, and it won't be easy." Tears finally broke free as Emily listened, realizing that even the help she so desperately sought came with conditions she wasn't sure she could fulfill. Her family had been her last refuge, and even they weren't offering comfort, only a cold reminder of the damage she had caused. When the call ended, she stood alone in the silence once more, clutching her phone tightly. The walls of the house seemed to close in around her, and the neat boxes by the door felt like a mockery of the life she had lost. There was no escape now. Everything was gone, her marriage, her affair, her family's respect. Emily sank to the floor, the weight of her choices finally crushing her completely. There was nothing left but the overwhelming guilt and the knowledge that she had done this to herself. Emily sat on the floor, her tears drying on her cheeks as she stared blankly at the boxes that now represented her shattered life. Everything had slipped away so quickly, her marriage, her affair, her family's respect, and now, there was nothing left but the bitter consequences of her choices. The phone lay silent beside her, no messages, no calls. Even the man she had risked everything for, Daniel, had abandoned her at her lowest moment. Her mind swirled with regret, playing back the events of the past few months. She had been so consumed by her desire for excitement, for something more than the steady but predictable life she had with Ryan. But in chasing that thrill, she had lost everything that truly mattered. She had allowed herself to believe that she could live two lives, that she could have it all without any cost. Now, the cost was all too clear. A new message pinged on her phone, breaking the heavy silence of the room. With a mix of dread and curiosity, Emily reached for it, her heart thudding in her chest. The message was from Ryan. She hesitated for a moment, afraid of what it might say, but her need to know overpowered her fear. "You made your choice." Those 4 words hit her harder than anything she had imagined. There was no anger in the message, no bitter remarks, just a simple statement of fact. Ryan had accepted what she had done, and now, he was moving on. He wasn't offering forgiveness, nor was he giving her any more chances. He had given her the life she claimed to want, and now she was left with nothing. Emily dropped the phone, her fingers numb. The realization of her isolation hit her fully for the first time. There would be no dramatic reconciliation, no last-minute escape from the mess she had created. The finality of Ryan's message echoed in her mind, making it clear that the life she once had was irreparably gone. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. She let out a sob, curling into herself on the floor, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. The life she had once thought so boring and unfulfilling was now a distant memory, one that she would never be able to return to. As the night deepened, Emily realized that this was her new reality. There was no turning back, no undoing what had been done. The only thing left was the painful truth: she had chosen this path, and now she would walk it alone. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.